The battle had ended 3 hours ago, but the station still felt like it was losing the war. Emergency lights painted the corridors in dull shades of red, while medics rushed casualties toward overcrowded treatment bays. Damaged fighters drifted through docking tunnels. Everywhere Ethan looked, someone was trying to save something before it failed completely. As a battlefield mechanic, he was used to chaos. Machines made sense. A reactor either worked or it didn't. A shield generator either held or collapsed. Metal followed rules. People were harder. Aliens were even worse. Ethan had just finished stabilizing a damaged troop transport when a military officer appeared beside him. "Mechanic Ethan Mercer?" He nodded. "You're being reassigned." That usually meant something important had broken. "What am I fixing?" Ethan asked. The officer hesitated. That alone caught his attention. Most officers barked orders without thinking twice. This one looked uncomfortable. A warrior. Ethan frowned. "I'm a mechanic. Not today." Before Ethan could ask another question, the officer motioned for him to follow. They passed through increasingly secure sections of the station. Armed guards stood outside. Medical personnel moved with unusual urgency. Whatever waited ahead wasn't ordinary. The officer eventually stopped outside an isolated treatment chamber. 2 alien doctors stood nearby. Neither looked happy. One of them noticed Ethan and immediately shook his head. "He's human." The officer folded his arms. "He's available." "That is not the same thing." The second doctor glanced toward the sealed room. "We need someone with repair experience." Ethan looked between them. "Can somebody tell me what's going on?" The doctors exchanged a look. Finally, the older one sighed. The patient survived injuries that should have been fatal. Good for her. Not necessarily. That answer raised more questions than it solved. The chamber door slid open. Ethan stepped inside. The room instantly felt quieter, heavier, like entering the presence of someone important. The patient sat upright on an elevated medical platform. At first glance, she looked intimidating enough to command an army. Tall, broad-shouldered, covered in battle scars. Her silver-gray skin carried dozens of old wounds that had healed long ago. Several fresh injuries remained visible beneath damaged armor, but it wasn't her appearance that grabbed Ethan's attention. It was everyone else's reaction to her. The doctors stayed near the doorway. The guards avoided eye contact. Nobody approached her unless absolutely necessary. Fear, not panic. Respectful fear. The kind reserved for predators. The alien woman slowly turned her head toward Ethan. Golden eyes studied him. Evaluated him. Then apparently dismissed him as unimportant. Her attention shifted away. That annoyed him more than it should have. "So what's broken?" Ethan asked. One of the doctors activated a holographic display. A rotating image of the warrior's armor appeared. A large crack spread across the chest section. Internal systems flashed warning signals. Power levels continued dropping. "Damage is spreading," the doctor explained. "If it reaches critical failure, we lose her." Ethan stepped closer to examine the armor. The chestplate looked strange. Not because it was alien. He worked around alien technology every day. No, something about the damage pattern felt wrong. The crack resembled a fracture in bone rather than metal. He leaned closer. The readings became even stranger. "Where are the internals?" Neither doctor answered immediately. Ethan checked again. Nothing. No wiring. No power conduits. No energy channels. The chestplate should have contained dozens of mechanical systems. Instead, the sensors displayed irregular biological signals, heartbeat patterns, neural activity, temperature fluctuations. The readings looked alive. Ethan assumed the scanners were malfunctioning. Battle damage often confused medical equipment. "These numbers make no sense." "We know," one doctor replied. "Can you repair it?" Ethan crouched beside the platform. The warrior remained perfectly still. A closer inspection revealed microscopic movement beneath the fractured surface. Tiny pulses, almost like breathing. His frown deepened. "Has anyone opened it?" The room became silent. The doctors avoided his gaze. "Interesting, no?" "No, why not?" Again, silence. That answer bothered him more than any explanation could have. Something was being left unsaid. Ethan activated a handheld diagnostic scanner. Additional data appeared. The biological readings intensified. Definitely alive. Definitely impossible. He glanced toward the warrior. For the first time, she looked directly at him. There was something unexpected in her eyes. Not aggression. Not arrogance. Worry. The realization caught him off guard. This feared warrior looked worried. About the chestplate. Not herself. The chestplate. Ethan carefully reached toward the damaged section. His fingers moved closer to the largest crack. If he could access the interior, maybe he could identify what was causing the strange signals. Just a quick inspection, nothing more. The instant his hand touched the surface, everything changed. The warrior moved. Fast. Far faster than someone carrying multiple injuries should have been capable of moving. Her hand shot forward. Strong fingers locked around his wrist. The grip stopped his movement instantly. Every guard in the room tensed. Doctors froze. Nobody spoke. The warrior's eyes locked onto him. For a moment, Ethan understood why entire battlefields feared her species. There was incredible strength hidden behind those golden eyes. Then, he noticed something else. Fear. Real fear. Not for herself, for whatever rested beneath the damaged armor. Her grip loosened slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Almost gentle. Careful. One word. Yet it carried enough urgency to stop him cold. Ethan slowly lowered his scanner. Why? The warrior remained silent for several seconds, as though deciding whether he deserved the truth. Finally, she looked down at the fractured chestplate. If you remove it incorrectly, her voice became softer. Both of us will die. Ethan blinked. Both? He looked around the room. Nobody appeared surprised. The doctors already knew. The guards knew. Everyone knew except him. What do you mean both? The warrior released his wrist. For the first time, the legendary soldier looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a burden for too long. She carefully placed a hand over the damaged section. The movement felt protective, almost affectionate. Then she met Ethan's gaze again, and finally revealed the truth. The chestplate is not armor. Ethan stared at her. The warrior looked down at the fractured surface. A pulse moved beneath it. Slow, weak, alive. When she spoke again, her voice barely rose above a whisper. It is a living creature. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Every strange reading, every nervous doctor, every unanswered question. They all clicked into place. The biological signals weren't inside the armor. They were the armor. And whatever lived beneath that fractured shell wasn't attached to her equipment. It was attached directly to her heart. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Ethan simply stared at the damaged chestplate. A living creature. The statement sounded impossible, yet every sensor reading suddenly made sense. The heartbeat patterns, the neural activity, the strange fluctuations that refused to match any known machine. They had never been mechanical signals. They were biological. Slowly, Ethan looked back at the alien woman. What exactly is attached to you? The warrior lowered her eyes toward the fractured armor. For the first time since he had entered the room, she seemed less like a legendary soldier and more like someone worried about losing a friend. We call them Vael. The translation software struggled briefly before settling on the term. Symbiotes. One of the doctors stepped forward. Seeing Ethan's confusion, he activated a holographic display. Ancient images appeared. Alien children. Alien warriors. Alien elders. Every single one wore a living chestplate. No. Not war. Shared, the distinction became clearer the more Ethan watched. The bond begins shortly after birth. The doctor explained. The symbiote develops alongside the host throughout life. Images shifted. Children playing. The creatures growing larger over time. Changes occurring in perfect synchronization. If the host becomes stronger, the symbiote adapts. Another image appeared. Battle footage. A warrior surviving injuries that should have been fatal. The symbiote strengthens the immune system. Another image. Hostile environments, toxic atmospheres, extreme temperatures. The symbiote provides environmental protection. Another image. Massive impacts, energy weapons, explosive shockwaves. The symbiote functions as armor. Ethan folded his arms. So it isn't equipment. No, the doctor shook his head. It is considered family. The room became quiet. That changed everything. Machines could be replaced. Family could not. Ethan looked toward the warrior. What happens if it dies? The answer came immediately. I die. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just fact. The warrior's voice remained calm. Our nervous systems are linked. She placed a hand against the damaged surface. When it suffers, I suffer. The holographic display changed again. Medical scans filled. Several sections glowed red. Critical damage markers appeared. The doctor's expression darkened. The battle damaged internal nutrient channels. Ethan examined the data. Can they be repaired? The doctor looked uncomfortable. Normally, that wasn't an answer. Ethan noticed. What's the problem? The doctor hesitated. The warrior answered instead. The standard treatment requires separation. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Separation? That sounded dangerous. How dangerous? The room fell silent. Finally, the doctor sighed. 31% survival rate. Ethan stared. That's the standard treatment? Yes. And the other 69%? Nobody answered. They didn't need to. The number spoke for itself. Most patients never came back. Ethan looked toward the warrior. She already knew. There was no fear in her face. Only accept. That somehow bothered him more. People accepted impossible odds when they had already run out of hope. You agreed to this? She gave a small nod. If necessary. Necessary, the word sounded wrong. Ethan returned his attention to the scans. Something about the diagnosis bothered him. The doctors had identified damage. That much seemed obvious. But every proposed solution focused on removing the symbiote. Nobody seemed interested in understanding why it was failing. That struck him as strange. Show me everything. The lead doctor frowned. Everything? Every scan. The doctor looked doubtful but complied. Dozens of diagnostic reports appeared. Hours passed. Then more. Medical staff came and went. The warrior remained seated in silence. Occasionally her breathing became strained. Occasionally pain crossed her face. But she never complained. Ethan barely noticed. His attention stayed fixed on the data. The more he studied it, the less sense the official diagnosis made. If the symbiote was dying, certain biological indicators should have collapsed. They hadn't. If organs were failing, specific chemical markers should have appeared. They hadn't. If irreversible damage had occurred, neural activity should have been decreasing. Instead, it remained surprisingly stable. Something wasn't adding up. Late into the cycle, Ethan requested access to the earliest scans taken immediately after the battle. The doctors seemed confused. What difference would that make? I don't know yet. The records appeared. Ethan compared them against current data. Then compared them again. His eyes narrowed. Interesting. Very interesting. The pattern wasn't worsening. It was changing. Those were two completely different things. He stood abruptly. The nearest doctor looked startled. What is it? Ethan pointed toward several highlighted readings. These nutrient channels. What about them? They're blocked. The doctor blinked. Yes, no. Ethan shook his head. They're damaged, but they're not completely blocked. The doctor studied the display. I don't understand. Ethan zoomed in. Tiny fluctuations became visible. Small, almost invisible. But definitely present. Something is still moving through them. The room grew quiet. Several doctors gathered closer. For the first time, they appeared genuinely interested. Ethan expanded additional scans. More patterns emerged. More inconsistencies. The official diagnosis began falling apart. If the symbiote were dying, he said slowly, why is metabolic activity remaining stable? Nobody answered. He continued. Why are regeneration systems still functioning? Silence. Why are neural pathways intact? The doctors exchanged uncertain looks. The warrior watched closely. For the first time, a small spark of hope appeared in her eyes. Ethan enlarged another section. There, one doctor leaned forward. What am I looking at? A living organism trying to heal itself. The doctor frowned. That's impossible. Why? Because the damage is too severe. Ethan crossed his arms. Then explained the regeneration activity. Nobody could. The room became increasingly uncomfortable. Years of medical assumptions were being questioned by a battlefield mechanic. One doctor finally spoke. What are you suggesting? Ethan stared at the data. He thought about Earth, about animals, about injured wildlife, about veterinary medicine. Humanity had spent centuries helping living things recover despite limited technology. Sometimes healing wasn't about replacing damaged parts. Sometimes it was about giving the body what it needed to heal itself. A possibility began forming. Simple. Almost embarrassingly simple. Which was exactly why nobody had considered it. He looked toward the warrior. When was the last time it received full nutrient flow? The doctor checked the records. Immediately before the battle, Ethan nodded slowly, then he looked back at the scans. Everything suddenly aligned. The damage, the symptoms, the stalled recovery, the fluctuating readings, not death. Starvation. The realization hit him like a shockwave. The symbiote wasn't failing because it couldn't heal. It was failing because it lacked the resources required to heal. The damage had disrupted delivery pathways. Nothing more. Nothing less. The creature wasn't dying. It was trying desperately to survive. Ethan turned toward the gathered doctors. I don't think your patient is dying. Several expressions hardened instantly. The lead doctor folded his arms. Explain. Ethan pointed toward the biological readings. I think it's starving. The room exploded with objections. Impossible, incorrect, ridiculous. Several doctors immediately dismissed the theory. Others argued that centuries of medical science couldn't be wrong. The debate grew louder. Only one individual remained silent. The warrior. She watched Ethan carefully, studying him the same way he had studied the scans. After a long moment, she finally spoke. The room immediately fell quiet. You believe it can be saved? Ethan looked at the damaged chest plate. He looked at the weak pulses still moving beneath the fractured surface. Then he nodded. For the first time since entering the treatment chamber, he genuinely believed survival was possible. Yes. The warrior held his gaze. Hope and fear battled across her face, because if he was right, everything changed. And if he was wrong, she would lose far more than her own life. Ethan looked toward the doctors. The problem isn't that you're treating a dying patient. He pointed toward the chest plate. The problem is that you've been treating the wrong illness. The reaction was immediate. Several doctors began arguing before Ethan had even finished speaking. One demanded evidence. Another insisted centuries of medical knowledge couldn't be overturned by a human mechanic with no formal biological training. A third openly questioned why they were listening to him at all. Ethan expected resistance. What surprised him was how defensive they became. Not because they disliked his theory. Because they needed it to be wrong. If he was right, then countless previous patients might have died from treatments that never should have happened. That was not an easy possibility to accept. The lead doctor silenced the room with a raised hand. Then he looked directly at Ethan. You are proposing an alternative treatment? Yes. What exactly? Ethan enlarged the nutrient flow diagrams. The symbiote is trying to repair itself. We know that. No, Ethan shook his head. You know it's attempting regeneration. You don't know why it keeps failing. The doctor folded his arms. Then tell us. Ethan highlighted several damaged pathways. These channels carry nutrients from host to symbiote. Everyone nodded. That was basic knowledge. The damage disrupted delivery. Correct. So instead of removing the symbiote, why not restore delivery? The room fell quiet. Not because the idea was revolutionary. Because it sounded embarrassingly obvious. The doctors immediately searched for flaws. There is no approved procedure. There doesn't need to be. The biological risks are unknown. The biological risks are already happening. Another doctor stepped forward. The symbiote may reject artificial support. Ethan pointed toward the scans. It hasn't rejected anything. The debate continued for nearly an hour. Every objection met a response. Every argument eventually collapsed beneath the evidence. Slowly, resistance weakened. Not because Ethan won. Because the data did. Eventually, the lead doctor looked toward the warrior. The decision technically belonged to her. The treatment carried enormous risk. Failure would almost certainly kill both host and symbiote. The warrior remained silent for several moments. Then, she looked directly at Ethan. Would you trust this treatment? It was a simple question. Not whether he thought it might work. Whether he trusted it. Ethan considered the answer carefully. Then nodded. Yes, the warrior never looked away. Then, proceed. The room became silent. Just like that, the decision was made. Preparations began immediately. Ethan wasn't interested in complex equipment. He wasn't trying to replace the symbiote's healing process. He wanted to support it. There was a difference. Most of the station's advanced medical technology focused on intervention. Human medicine often focused on recovery. Sometimes the body already knew what to do. It simply needed help getting there. Over the next several hours, Ethan worked alongside a handful of increasingly curious doctors. Together they built a temporary nutrient delivery system. Nothing elegant, nothing revolutionary, just a method for bypassing damaged pathways. A bridge instead of a replacement. The warrior watched the entire process, occasionally asking questions, mostly observing. At some point Ethan realized she had stopped referring to him as human. Now she used his name. The small change meant more than he expected. When the system was finally ready, the treatment chamber filled with nervous anticipation. Every monitor was active. Every doctor was present. No one wanted to miss the outcome. Success would challenge established medical doctrine. Failure would prove the doctors right. Either way, history was about to happen. Ethan took a final look at the readings, then activated the system. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the monitors exploded with activity. The entire room tensed. Nutrient flow surged. Neural signals spiked. Biological readings fluctuated wildly. Several alarms activated simultaneously. One doctor cursed. Another immediately reached for emergency shutdown controls. Something is wrong. Ethan grabbed the doctor's arm. No, the readings climbed higher. Then higher still. The warrior suddenly inhaled sharply. Pain crossed her face. Her hands clenched. The reaction looked violent enough to terrify everyone watching. Doctors rushed toward her. The lead physician looked ready to terminate the procedure. Ethan. Wait, her pain levels are spiking. I know. Then stop. Ethan continued watching the monitors. Pain wasn't always a sign of failure. Healing hurt. Especially after prolonged damage. He focused on the symbiote's biological activity. There, exactly what he had hoped to see. Damaged regions were responding. Metabolic activity was increasing. Regeneration pathways were activating. The symbiote wasn't rejecting treatment. It was waking. Ethan, the lead doctor's voice sharpened. Give me one reason not to stop this. Without looking away from the monitors, Ethan answered. Because it's working. The room fell silent. Several doctors checked the readings themselves. One by one, their expressions changed. Confusion, disbelief, shock. The numbers didn't lie. Regeneration rates were climbing. For the first time since the battle, damaged tissue was actively repairing itself. The symbiote had begun healing. The warrior gritted her teeth against another wave of pain. Sweat appeared across her forehead. Still, she refused to complain. Instead, she looked toward Ethan. What is happening? The answer came from one of the doctors. A doctor who had spent most of the day arguing. His voice sounded stunned. It's recovering. The words seemed impossible, yet everyone could see the evidence. The damaged chest plate shifted slightly. Microscopic fractures began closing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but undeniably. A living organism was repairing itself. Hours passed. The process continued. Steady improvement replaced panic. Emergency alarms disappeared. Vital signs stabilized. Even the atmosphere inside the room changed. For the first time since Ethan arrived, people allowed themselves to hope. The lead doctor approached him. "You were correct." Ethan smiled faintly. "Looks that way." "No," the doctor shook his head. "You understood something we did not." Before Ethan could respond, another alert appeared. The room froze. Everyone turned toward the monitors. Regeneration activity had not slowed. Stopped. Complete biological inactivity spread through the display. The symbiote's healing systems shut down instantly. A heavy silence settled across the chamber. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The warrior looked toward Ethan. Fear returned to her eyes, the same fear he had seen when she first warned him away from the chest plate. One doctor rushed toward the monitors. Another checked the nutrient system. A third reviewed biological data. Nothing explained the sudden change. Everything appeared functional. Yet the symbiote had entered a dormant state. The lead doctor stared at the readings. What happened? No one had an answer. Moments earlier, they had been celebrating recovery. Now, uncertainty returned. The improvement had been real. The healing had been real. But if the symbiote remained dormant, regeneration would stop completely. And without regeneration, the damage would eventually become fatal once again. Ethan looked at the warrior, then at the motionless readings, then back at the chest plate. Something felt wrong. Not mechanically, not medically. Personally, the creature wasn't acting like something dying. It was acting like something afraid. The thought arrived unexpectedly, and once it appeared, he couldn't ignore it. The symbiote had survived. The treatment had worked. Yet somehow, it still refused to fully awaken. As doctors searched desperately for biological explanations, Ethan found himself wondering whether they were making the same mistake all over again. Because maybe the next problem wasn't physical. And if he was right, no machine in the galaxy would be able to solve it. Meanwhile, the dormant symbiote remained silent. And with every passing minute, the clock continued counting down toward a fate neither Ethan nor the warrior was willing to accept. The treatment chamber had become strangely quiet. Not because people had stopped working. Because nobody understood what they were looking at anymore. The symbiote was alive. Every scan confirmed that. Its vital systems remained stable. Nutrient delivery continued successfully. The damage was no longer worsening. Yet the regeneration process had completely stopped. The creature had simply gone dormant. The doctors searched for medical explanations. Equipment was recalibrated. Diagnostic programs were rerun. Additional scans filled the displays. Nothing changed. Hours passed. The warrior's condition remained stable, but only barely. Without active regeneration, the damaged sections would eventually fail again. The treatment had bought time. Nothing more. The lead doctor finally looked toward Ethan. "You were right before." There was exhaustion in his voice. "Do you have another theory?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the chest plate, at the faint pulses moving beneath its surface, at the creature everyone kept treating like a biological machine. Then he remembered something. The holographic records, the childhood images, the bond between host and symbiote. Not equipment, not technology. Family. The realization returned stronger than before. Everyone was still focusing on biology. Maybe biology wasn't the problem. He turned toward the warrior. "What is its name?" Several doctors looked confused. The warrior looked surprised. For a moment she simply stared at him. Then she answered. "Sael." The translation carried unusual warmth. Not a designation, not a classification. A name. Ethan nodded slowly. "When was the last time you spoke to it?" The question caught everyone off guard. One doctor immediately objected. "Spoke to it? The warrior ignored him, her eyes lowered toward the damaged chest plate. Before the battle. And after? Silence. The answer was obvious. There had been no after. Only pain. Injury, fear, constant medical procedures. The warrior slowly closed her eyes. I thought I was losing it. Ethan nodded. That was exactly what he suspected. The doctors continued looking confused. One finally spoke. What does this have to do with regeneration? Ethan looked at him. You said they're bonded. Yes, they share pain. Yes, they develop together. Yes, Ethan spread his hands. Then why are we assuming emotions aren't part of that bond? Nobody answered. The question hung in the air. Uncomfortable, difficult, the kind of question that sounded ridiculous until nobody could find a reason it was wrong. The warrior looked down at for the first time, uncertainty appeared on her face. You think it is afraid? Ethan nodded. I think it survived something traumatic. The room fell silent. The idea sounded absurd. Until everyone remembered the battle. The injuries. The near-death experience. The failed medical procedures. The constant fear of separation. Maybe the symbiote wasn't refusing to heal. Maybe it was refusing to wake up. The warrior's expression slowly changed. A memory seemed to surface. When I was young, everyone turned toward her. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. Our elders taught us that symbiotes understand emotion. Several doctors exchanged uncertain looks. Ancient traditions were rarely considered scientific evidence. But Ethan wasn't interested in tradition. He was interested in result. And right now, nobody had a better idea. The warrior carefully placed both hands over the damaged chest plate. For several moments, she remained silent. The room watched. Waiting. Nothing happened. Then, she began speaking. Not to the doctors, not to Ethan, to Sayel. Her voice was softer than anyone had ever heard. She spoke about childhood memories. The day they first bonded, the training fields where they learned together, victories they shared, mistakes they survived, long journeys, old friendships, moments no scanner could measure, moments no medical textbook could explain. The chamber remained silent. Even the doctors stopped working. One by one, everyone listened. The warrior's voice trembled only once. When she spoke about the battle. I thought I lost. Her hand tightened slightly against the damaged chest plate. I was afraid. The confession seemed difficult, perhaps more difficult than any injury. I know you were afraid too. A faint pulse appeared beneath the fractured surface. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The pulse appeared again, stronger this time. The nearest doctor stared at his monitor, then stared again. His eyes widened. Regeneration activity. Every head snapped toward the display. The readings were rising. Slowly, steadily, impossible numbers began appearing. Neural pathways reactivated. Biological functions accelerated. Dormant systems awakened one after another. The warrior never stopped speaking. She continued sharing memories, promises, gratitude, everything she would have said if she believed she might never see her companion again. The chest plate responded. Tiny fractures began closing. Damaged tissue regenerated. The faint glow beneath the surface strengthened. A doctor checked the data 3 separate times before speaking. I don't understand. Another shook his head. No biological trigger is present. Ethan smiled. That wasn't entirely true. There was a trigger. They simply hadn't been measuring it. The regeneration rate doubled, then doubled again. The room watched in stunned silence as damage that had resisted treatment for days began disappearing. The symbiote wasn't merely recovering. It was fighting. For the first time since the battle, it wanted to live. Hours later, the transformation became undeniable. The fractured chest plate had begun rebuilding itself. Living material spread across damaged sections. Cracks, structural layers reformed. The process looked almost miraculous. By the time the next cycle arrived, the symbiote had stabilized completely. The danger was over. The warrior survived. So did Sale. When the final medical reports were completed, Not a single doctor could dispute the outcome. The treatment worked. The human had been right. Again, several weeks later, Ethan found himself standing before a gathering of military leaders, scientists, and physicians. The case had spread throughout the sector. Researchers wanted answers. Governments wanted reports. Medical institutions wanted access to every piece of data. The lead doctor addressed the assembly personally. The human mechanic identified solutions our experts over. Murmurs spread throughout the audience. The doctor continued, "We focused on procedures." A pause. He focused on understanding the patient. The distinction changed everything. Over the following months, medical academies began reviewing human approaches to biology. Not because human technology was superior. It wasn't. Not yet. Humanity was still young compared to many galactic civilizations, but humans possessed something unusual. They treated living things differently. They observed, adapted, questioned assumptions. Most importantly, they understood that not every problem could be solved by replacing damaged parts. Sometimes healing required compassion. The warrior recovered fully. Her reputation as a legendary soldier only grew. Yet whenever she was asked about her survival, she gave the same answer. Not the doctors. Not the technology. Not the military. A human mechanic. Eventually she stood before a council representing dozens of worlds. When asked what lesson should be learned from the incident, she answered without hesitation. Our greatest mistake was believing humans were primitive because their technology was young. The chamber fell silent. She rested a hand against the now perfect chest. What saved me wasn't advanced science. A small smile appeared. It was a human's willingness to care. Years later, the story was still told across the empire. Not as a tale about a warrior, not as a tale about medicine, but as a reminder. Because on the day a human mechanic refused to treat a living creature like a machine, 2 lives were saved. And in the process, humanity earned a reputation no weapon could have won. The species that understood life itself.